Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today. We're going to be speaking about leadership and governance today, the importance of governance from a lived experience perspective. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we live and work on, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to pay our respects to people with lived experience who are watching this today. And Tim, Paula, and I all have lived experience, and we'd like to acknowledge people who care about people with lived experience. And as I always say, we know that's you, because otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. So I'm honoured again to have Paula Hanlon and Tim Heffernan join me to discuss governance. And Paula and Tim and I have all worked in several governance roles. So we might tell you that, but the most important thing that we want to tell you is why that's important too. How it worked while we were doing it or are doing it, and what's important for the future. So, Tim, can I start with you?
Well, I think governance is any organisation has the obligation to operate effectively, but I think governance is also about ensuring the best outcomes for the people who are using the service and the workforce that are delivering those sorts of things. It's making sure that the right things happen at the right time, I suppose. And so, traditionally with mental health services, we've had, say, clinical governance where people will ensure that all of the procedures are done according to evidence-based practice, etc., and that the delivery of clinical services is consistent and repeatable and all those sorts of things. You would have I think with mental health services for a long time, you've had governance around risk, which has been really concentrated on. I'm not saying I agree with all of
No.
these things as being totally important. You have governance of finances as well, financial sort of governance. The thing that interests me and has always interested me is how the people who use the service need to be involved in governance. And in fact, I think predating my first peer worker job was involvement in the local health district here in the Illawarra Shoalhaven, in the what was called the Four Cs Committee, which was the Consumer and Carer Governance Consultative Committee, Consumer and Carer Consultative Committee. There you are. And I recall, as a way of starting to be involved in something. But I think my experiences of that were largely that it was fairly tokenistic, that that the service director that attended that meeting would often come to the next meeting and, having not taken any of the action seriously, not implemented any of the recommendations from the previous meeting, and it just seemed to be like a voiceless and meaningless exercise in the end. And I suppose I became a little bit cynical about governance and then moved more to service delivery through peer work, which I enjoyed a lot. But I have had other experience of governance, including governance of a consumer-run organisation, which is the New South Wales Consumer Advisory Group, called Being, the Mental Health Commission, where Faye, you've been a deputy commissioner, the inaugural lived experience deputy commissioner. We've been there, and when you started off as the deputy commissioner, Paula and I started off there on the Community Advisory Council, which advised the commission on its policies, on its direction, on its strategic planning. So they've been really important. I think the health as a whole is still finding out how to best implement lived experience governance amongst its various structures and arms. It's really important. Yeah.
you've been involved in some work federally too around governance, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I think the National Commission at various stages has has undertaken important work around the peer workforce development guidelines, which was all lived experience governance in the steering committee for that. But then the national stigma and discrimination strategy, which I co-chaired with the Honourable Kevin Bell, was one which had a mixture of a whole range of people from various walks of life involved in it. I think another important governance structure is one that the primary health networks have in terms of the mental health lived experience engagement network.
Mm-hmm.
So, Malene, who we'll probably talk about more as we go along today, have a role of ensuring the delivery and growth of consumer and carer participation and peer work at that national level. So that's been a really important governance mechanism. Yeah.
Would you like to explain what Malene is, Tim?
Well, Malene is the Mental Health Lived Experience Engagement Network. So each PHN contributes a member or more to that whose portfolio is really around consumer and carer engagement and participation, and also the peer workforce. So it's really looking at how those important aspects of lived experience are central to the work of the mental health teams in primary health networks. Also has had another arm to it called the LEAD, the Lived Experience Activist Delegates, who are people who are not working for the PHN but use the PHN, and they come into that assuming sort of leadership roles and consultative roles as well. What with myself and Paula Arrow, who's the chair of that group, we really want designated lived experience roles within PHNs to be part of the staff of PHNs, which is not really governance, it's part of the workforce, but it has that effect of giving that voice. And I think when we started in 2017, there were only 2 of us with lived experience. When I left some time ago, I think it had grown to around 10 or so. Oh, here's Kerry popping in. Isn't that good?
That's great. Hello, Kerry.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry to drop in like this.
No, that's all right. It's great that you've been able to join us. So, Kerry, Paula, I'll come back to you in just a second. So Kerry, thank you for joining us. Everybody, this is Kerry Hawkins, and Kerry is actually a carer family kin advocate, but has been involved in governance at all levels and the highest levels too within Australia. So Kerry, would you be able to tell us about what governance, how lived experience in governance is important and how it's working?
Yeah, thanks, Faye. It's such a great question. I think, and I've been thinking about the role and the function of governance quite a bit lately in various roles that I'm in. And if you think about it as a sort of collective and organised effort to deliver something, just who are the decision makers and what are they making decisions about, and the allocation, particularly of resources for the common good. I think within the context of mental health and mental health reform at the moment, it's such a topical and probably contested innovation. So when you think about the outcomes for people with a lived experience of interacting with services and our systems, we know that they're not always that great. And we know that our systems do violate people's human rights in all kinds of ways, not just the civic and the political, or the civil and the political, but also socioeconomic and cultural as well. And so the need for people with a lived experience to inform decision making has never been greater. And so for me, I've been working in this space for a couple of years now to flesh out, well, what does that mean? So what does it mean to have people with lived experience in roles of governance? And in fact, what does it mean from a lived experience perspective to have a lived experience governance framework, which is one of the things we designed and co-delivered with the PHN Lived Experience Network, which really tries to set out that actually we think about the nature of distress and the requirements of people in terms of delivering those outcomes in a very, very different way, particularly around risk and around safety and quality. And so what it does do is really drive a very, very different way of doing governance. And actually, if you think about governance very often, it's very focused on the means. So how are we measuring things? We measure finances, we measure risk, but we don't necessarily always focus on the ends. So we don't focus on delivering human rights for everyone, and we don't measure that ever in any of our artifacts of the current sort of bioclinical or biomedical models that we're using. And so I think we have a long way to go, and we're really just starting it in terms of understanding what that might look like and how we might reshape organisations and governance to deliver some of those things.
A very senior public servant said that we've advertising these positions for, you know, executive or senior management or that will influence governance, but people aren't applying. Well, you know, why? Where are they? And I said, you need to understand, it wasn't that long ago that all we had was a few peer workers, and then the peer work movement grew, and the peer work numbers grew, and the respect for peer work grew, and then we've started getting these more senior roles. Paula's been on the Flourish Australia board for 10 years, Paula. I was on the commission some time back, and I was a director in the mental health service in the Illawarra, 25 years ago or so. Tim's been in governance positions, and you, Kerry, but they've been very few and far between, and there aren't a lot of people that have had the experience yet or the education yet to be able to take on these roles. But we're coming in in numbers now, and I think that we'll be able to shift things much more in the future. That's my hope anyway. Paula, could I just ask you to talk about your experiences of governance and why you think it's important?
Yeah, thanks, Faye. Well, I got a few roles. So within my day-to-day job, I sit on peak committees where we look at policy and procedure, and part of that is bringing in the consumer voice to and I have had opportunities where I've made meaningful change in a document. So I believe that we are truly being invited in, which is nice. Not everything we say gets in. One of the things I've learned in working with the governance structure is that we don't always get everything we want. So, aim for high and then, work out, okay, what's my threshold? I've also chaired the New South Wales Consumer Workers Committee, and I was really glad while in that role, I was able to bring together, like a minimum, we had 2 representatives from every local health district, so that we had equity in the voices from across New South Wales. That's been really great to see that that's continued and grown, and that is, a consumer group, consumer peer work lived experience group that has now invited in the NGO sector, community managed sector. So it's been a fantastic process. I think we still need to do better to liaise with the New South Wales Health around that. with Flourish Australia, that's been I've nearly finished my 10-year term. And that's been an amazing journey for me because I came in as a long-term, I had been a client of Richmond Fellowship Services many years ago. Then I came in as a board member. I had previously been a member of the Richmond Fellowship Board, and then I was asked to come back just as the Richmond Fellowship and PRA. Thank you.
Psychiatric Rehabilitation Association.
Yeah. So when those two services were coming together to make Flourish Australia, I was very fortunate to be on the board then, and I feel that I've had a very respected role. I feel like the other directors respect my opinion. I took on chairing the services quality and risk meeting last year. And it was funny because I knew that my first meeting, I was going to be really carefully watched and assessed and judged as to whether Paula can actually do this. And it was after that, then I was told that I was able to be, because they thought I did a good job. But it's been a really good experience to chair a subcommittee of the board. And
especially that committee, like that's a very particular committee, isn't it? And traditionally, probably clinical services would think that people with lived experience have no place in that kind of discussion.
Yes,
exactly. Kerry, can I ask you to comment on that? Is that something that you would have seen in the past, or
which bit in particular? Sorry,
about
Faye,
that people with lived experience have been kind of blocked out of in the public systems being chairs, let alone chairs of quality and risk and safeguarding and that kind of.
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal mold breaking experience, Paula. It's very, very, very rare, I think, given the legislative framework, the standards frameworks, and it's, for me, the safety and quality space is where we have yet to make, I think, the biggest transformation. We still make decisions according to probably clinical understandings of risk and clinical understandings of safety. I know when we did the one of the 5th plan action items was the safety and quality engagement framework, the national piece of work, and which was to help equip people to participate in exactly those kinds of committees, as well as help organisations to make the conditions right. And we did find that people had very, very different understandings and expectations of what safety is and what quality is as well. So for Paula to be in those kinds of committees where there's vastly different power differentials, vastly different understandings, is such an enormous achievement. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I feel some of the things that we've been able to really impact on was accessing the Community Advisory Council. And really what I'm seeing now is everything goes to the council. The people with lived experience that are on the council, we get their feedback in amongst all the others. So I'm so proud of that. I think that's been great. The other thing that I feel that I've been able to really help along was like supervision process for Flourish Australia peer workforce. And so I'm really keen to see how things are then evaluated. It's wonderful to have the council and the links, and the council members are included in strategic planning days. They're there at all events. It's just fantastic. The allyship that we have from the senior leadership team and the other board members. I think we're very, very lucky to have wonderful directors.
Flourish Australia talks about person-led services, and I think that's a critical underpinning of governance. So the council are up to 24 people, around that number, who access the service, and some of the people over the years, I've supported it over the last 10 years. Some of the people have really struggled to read and write. Some can't read and write. Some people are hearing voices all the time. Some people are trying to cope with really severe anxiety and you know, the range of things. But we start with, when I start talking, when youth council members come on, I tell them, you know, purposefully tell them about my lived experience and that I'm a voice here and one thing to another to help them to relax straight away. And it's just amazing the leadership that they grow so quickly when you put faith in them, and you know, you expect them to work hard, and they do, you know. It's just, and to see there, like recently one of the council members said that they've put 90% of their recovery down to the work that they've done in the council. So lived experience governance can sound daunting, but can actually be an incredibly liberating thing for the people involved, as well as the services who learn about different ways of thinking, lived experience ways of thinking and planning and doing the work of services. So, Tim,
For it to be, sorry, for it to be effective, though, you need that the acknowledgement from that leadership team, senior leadership team, and the CEO from the top. They have to be willing to listen and to reflect and give credence to the voices of the people that are represented there. Yeah.
Traditionally in governance in services, you've got the board, and then you might have the, you know, as Paula mentioned, the safety and quality committee, and you have the finance committee and one thing. Have you heard of any other lived experience models of governance that are different to those traditional ways of thinking?
I think there's a development in the NGO sector around having like a parallel board. So you have your board, so-called expertise, and then you have a parallel board that is made up of lived experience. So, and they work in conjunction with each other. And so I think, you know, to me, this governance thing is about scale, and this is where I think Flourish has got it right. So the scale of that has led to the changes of culture. So a significant change of culture that you mentioned is the move from this entrapping sort of idea of person-centered, where the person's in the center and getting, you know, chuffed around by everyone, and to that person-led sort of culture that you've got there. And you know, I think the scale of having your group there as well is quite significant. And this is where I think your public mental health services need to be looking seriously at what the NGO sector is doing in terms of governance and in terms of elevating that lived experience governance aspect. So, you know, at the moment, I think most, and this is a little bit different to your question, but most public mental health services would have a clinical governance council, and ones whereby people are with lived experience are largely locked out of, and they certainly don't have the really strong mechanisms to engage with a lived experience governance unit or group that might sit with the same sort of authority in the overall governance structure as the clinical council. So I think we need to be working towards having a group of people that lived experience governance in all our public mental health services, as well as the ones you've mentioned at Flourish. And you know, I think other organisations like NEMI are adopting that sort of parallel structure. You know, I think with our peak bodies, there's always a argy-bargy around, you know, do we have people on boards who are experts by experience? Should everybody on a board of, say, Being or VIMIAC have lived experience? should the CEO have lived experience, we'll be facing the same sorts of arguments or same sorts of questions as we move to our national organisations, you know. And, you know, I obviously think it can, you know, people with lived experience can do and do have expertise as well. So it's about recruiting the right people to the right positions. I'm not sure that we've always done that recruitment effectively. And I've been in the position where you sit on a lot of committees, and to some extent you might be excluding other people. So it needs to be more people involved in governance, perhaps more groups of people involved in governance, so that we can reflect what our workforce and our movement's about, which is about collaboration, it's about community, it's about relationships, and how do we bring all that into governance structures.
Kerry, have you heard of any other sort of lived experience governance structures that are different or emerging or being considered? Or
not really. I think I'm on one of those parallel structures. I'm the carer co-chair family. I'm still working, edging people away from the carer nomenclature. But so the magnificent Debbie Hamilton is the consumer co-chair of a particular parallel board that I'm on, and it's such an extraordinarily brave step, I think, to take for organisations to really have a good hard look at how they can share power and devolve power. I think we're all talking about, when we talk about governance, we are talking about sharing power. So that's one that I'm involved with that's extraordinarily exciting. I think for me, there's a little bit of a conceptual distinction between lived experience leadership, which I think we're talking about, you know, being the member of a committee, for example, and being on committees, which I think can be sometimes a little bit problematic. We haven't done enough capacity building even in that space. But even then, that I think for me is different to lived experience governance understandings. And I'm very, very keen for things like that lived experience governance framework to be a lot more socialized, so that we can start to unpack exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about lived experience governance. And I think even, you know, lived experience leadership, because we are now moving into a space where these are all remunerated positions, it's gone from being a highly stigmatized, discriminated against role description to something now that is becoming very, very attractive for many people. I'm really interested in how we can avoid, my colleague Margaret Doherty talks about the seduction of inclusion. So how do we ensure that we keep the fidelity to the roots and the substance of what is lived experience, so we kind of don't gloss over it and just everyone become lived experience leaders, but losing that sense of having to stand up and speak up and so on. So I think it's the Royal Commission in Victoria, I think, really threw up some very innovative opportunities for lived experience leadership, whether it's like this parallel board that I'm on, whether it's things like the Collaborative Centre and the sort of the co-CEOs, or even the Healing Place and Rec 29, which is still yet to be funded. So I think there are innovative models that are emerging.
Could you just explain what Rec 29, recommendation 29 is, please, Kerry?
Yes. So obviously out of the Royal Commission, it was a recommendation that it be a lived experience-led agency that will drive so much more reform that is yet to come. So completely lived experience-led, thought leadership, developing innovative service models. I think it's one thing to talk about organizational reform, particularly in the NGO sector. I think, you know, we can achieve a lot in terms of collective impact, service by service, but what we're not really achieving is that fundamental transformation of public mental health services and the conceptualizations that sit behind it. So for me, Rec 29 is a keystone innovative model that we could use for lived experience leadership to really drive strongly the kinds of system reform, not organizational reform, but system reform that we're looking for. So I find it interesting that it's the one thing that has yet to be funded. It should have been one of the first things off the, cab off the rank if we're serious. You know, when I think about, obviously when I was just overseas looking at different models where there are innovative contemporary ways of doing things. I was in Brooklyn, where there's a very large, completely 100% lived experience led organisation that is just so profoundly impactful on people. It's been around for 30 years. Shout out to Baltic Street. And there's over 100 full-time employees, all with lived experience. The board is 100% lived experience. So it can be done as such a critical component of driving system reform. Yeah.
Or revolution. So but Tim and Kerry, you've both talked about parallel boards. Could you tell me what you think are the pros and cons for a parallel board? You know, like for some people would be saying, well, why have parallel when you shouldn't people with lived experience be on the board? That's it. One board, the board, people with lived experience in it, leading it, chairing it, whatever. Why have parallel?
It's not just parallel. That's probably the wrong visualization of it. I think it's essential that people from that lived experience board are also on board. So there's a crossover. So there would be the leaders, say, of that lived experience board who would be essential and integral members. I think the risk of having these sorts of boards is that they become tokenistic, and that they meet, and what happens there doesn't really become part of the organisation as strongly as it could. So I think Kerry's best place to probably comment on that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I mean, and I think to your point, Faye, you know, absolutely, why can't we have both? So one of the boards I'm on, WAM, I'm the president of it. It's a peak body for community service sector in Western Australia. And we've, over a series of, over probably 10 years now, we're at the point where we've evolved our constitution so that we've got 5 designated lived experience roles on the board. So we're moving in that direction quite successfully. And I think one of the keys is that model that you talked to, Tim, where on the parallel, so, well, you're right, wrong analogy, wrong metaphor, but we will have 2 of the lived experience members on the board as well. So we ensure that that's sort of thoughtful crossover. I think I'm just trying to think through some of the constraints, I suppose, are that under the Corporations Act, for example, you know, you've got to have a board with directors, and so you can kind of either work slowly towards infiltrating a board so that there is lived experience on it. I think my experience of I've been on a few boards where there are lots of people with lived experience, but they've never had the capacity or the discipline to support them. So everyone will usually go onto one of these boards because they have an interest in mental health, usually because they have a personal or family experience, but we haven't done so they're very easily kind of subsumed into traditional governance ways of thinking, doing. We don't really place a lot of focus on building everybody's capacity to understand MAD studies, for example, or critical psychiatry, or any of the kind of really key conceptual understandings of lived experience expertise. So I think in some ways having this parallel body where that's exactly what we can focus on, and it gives us space to focus on privileging and grounding all of our work in First Nations thinking, for example, so we can really build up the capacity and the muscle around understanding lived experience expertise that we can then start to communicate with the board around as well. So you're right, there are absolutely pros and cons for all of these models. I think we should be just trying everything, frankly.
Paula, you've, as we know now that you've been involved in the governance in Flourish, could you give us some examples of how your involvement in governance has really directly impacted the culture and the way Flourish is working? And this isn't meant to be a Flourish ad. It's just that it's easy examples for us.
Yeah. Well, one of the examples that I have is I got involved with the recruitment subcommittee, and in that I was able to get the position that Faye has been in, recruited, and I was involved in the review of applications, the interviewing, the decision making, and it's very empowering to have your opinion taken into account. And the same thing with the current CEO. I was on that interview panel as well, and the whole recruitment phase. And there was only 3 of us from the board that were involved with that, and I was one of the 3. So, it feels really good. I think I'm aware of where my skills are. They're not in finance. Numbers do my head in. But one of the things that I've learned as a director is to ask for help. If I'm aware of what my responsibilities are as a director, to understand issues or decisions that need to be made and voting that needs to be undertaken. So to ask questions, it's so important that we clarify things and develop our skills and get involved, meet the staff, meet the people with lived experience, participate in going out to sites. It is a lot of work, but if you're prepared to give the commitment, people see that and they respect that. And I think that's really important.
That's great. Thank you. Jim, do you have any examples of where you've seen it really work, lived experience governance?
Look, I think within our peak bodies, having people with lived experience as the chairs, but also then that going through the organisation, and the organisation itself having people with lived experience as the CEO, etc., dramatically impacts on the way organisations work. I think reflecting on what Terry said before, I think what we bring to boards and to the culture of organisations is our experiences plus the experiences of the movement, and that's quite substantial when you look at a lot of the work that was done after the tragic death of Miriam Mertens at Lismore a while back. Involved people like yourself in lived experience roles who came in strongly and were integral at changing culture. I think it's important to understand that happens at the governance level and also the operational level, having people with lived experience. And this is why we're so particular about the need for people to be at all levels of organisations, operationally and in terms of governance, in that cultural change will only flow. So, we have a completely different viewpoint, so as a risk management committee might have. We're obviously looking at the dignity of the person and the capacity of the person to make their own decisions rather than have decisions made for them, and things like that. So I think it's really important. It does make a difference, and I think it's really made a significant difference across all of the community managed organisation or NGO sector. I think it's made a difference it's making a difference at that PHN level, as I said, with the Malene and people being involved in the advisory councils there. And I think it's ultimately it will impact at the level of public health. If we look at Victoria, for instance, on the back of the Royal Commission, you have mental health branch in Victoria having an executive director. It's an operational position, obviously, but then also about 20 people with lived experience working in that branch. And, that needs to be replicated across all our public mental health services.
I sat on the New South Wales Mental Health Clinical Council. I was the first peer worker to be involved at that level,
Mm.
at the peak level in
Yeah.
mental health in New South Wales. And that was that was amazing because, you know, we were in a huge room with these huge desks and you had a microphone in front of you. So you had to get used to pressing the button if you wanted to speak. But at my first meeting, I always had this sort of recipe for starting on a new committee, just to observe people and get the lay of the land before you open your mouth. But at my first meeting, I was asked my opinion.
Right.
And somebody disagreed, and I'm like, oh. And then the chair, who was the director for mental health for the state, he said, Paula, are you happy with that response? And I said, well, no, I'm not. And I was able then, so once again, it's having people at the top who understand why we are there, the value we bring, and then will help us take that step. Because it's very hard coming in as a person with lived experience when you haven't done anything like that before, and you're suddenly faced with this environment and people that are quite, you know, it's frightening, and for some of them were quite frightening to me, and there were some that didn't like me, and that was okay. I learned that they could have their opinion, I had mine. But, you know, one of the best things that happened not long before my term finished, the director was having to go to Parliament to say why the transfer of care policy had not been signed off. And we had the council meeting that morning, and he was asking us to sign off on it. And there was a section that I was not happy with. So I said, I'm sorry, I can't sign off on this. So he said to me, can we sit down at lunchtime and get the wording right so that you're happy to sign off on it? And that's what we did. And it went through with my suggestions, and because he understood where I was going. And this is one of the things we have to learn to, we have to develop our professionalism in these roles, and we have to be able to show why something is important. It's not just a matter of saying you need to do this. Why, how, you know, where's the evidence, what's the benefit, what's the risk, and I think all of those things. And I think we probably need more training to develop people to be able to step into these roles, because if we don't have people doing them efficiently and effectively, then those positions may not continue.
Tim, you mentioned a resource before that I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and sort of explain to people where they might be able to find that.
You know, as part of some joint work that was done between the National Mental Health Consumer and Carer Forum and Malene, which is the Mental Health Lived Experience Engagement Network that as part of the PHN structure, they came together to do a number of leadership type and governance projects, including the one around the Yale Leadership Project, where consumers initially and then family and other supporters had the opportunity to work with people from Yale University and experts in lived experience from around Australia and America to learn about leadership, lived experience leadership, and also then to foster their own project. But they also did some work around governance, which they did with the wonderful LELAN, which is the peak body, the Lived Experience Leadership Network in South Australia, led by Ellie Hodges. So they did a lived experience governance framework and also a lived experience governance toolkit. And both of those, if you go into the National Mental Health Consumer and Carer Forum website, I think it's the easiest way to find those. And you'll see them under the documents they've developed section. So they're both quite substantial pieces of work, and they really argue the case coherently and strongly for lived experience governance, to create organisations that are restorative, that are just and accountable. All of this governance is based on innovation, continuous improvement, partnerships and co-production, safeguarding responsibility and power, transforming our systems, our workforces and our practices. So I do commend those to you, and they bring to them those lived experience values, our principles, our ethics, and how we need to position ourselves in terms of changing cultures, of changing systems. So yeah.
The ethics and culture stuff is really important, isn't it? If the ethics aren't right and if the culture isn't right, that's where things go wrong. Governance often, I think, hinges a lot around the words. Words are really powerful, and I don't think we take enough notice of the impact that words can have. When I came into Flourish, they like all services were talking about person-centered services. And as I was one of the executive team, in my first meeting, I said, kind of almost under my breath, because I wasn't used to being really listened to and really respected in that at that executive kind of level in a way. And I said, well, I think it's a shame that we talk about person-centered services. We should have person-led services. And they stopped and said, what did you say? And I said, oh, well, I think we should have person-led services, not person-centered, because in my experience, person-centered services mean you sit in the middle and everybody sits around, clinicians, psychologists, psych nurses, everybody sits around telling you where you will and won't live, what you will and won't take, what you can and can't do with your life, rather than us leading our healing and our recovery. And Flourish went, okay, we'll shift to person-led, and just moving from person-centered to person-led really changed the culture, I think, and that really changed, the growth of the voice of lived experience in the design, the reporting, the reviewing of Flourish services. So I think that we really need to be mindful of what we think is important, not for us as individuals, obviously, but for our community of people with lived experience, and what words we'll use in these positions that will influence the way people with lived experience are seen, respected, valued. I think that we can pose a threat in governance positions for services that don't recognise how valuable the voice of lived experience is at governance level. But I don't think we're going to see the changes that we need to see, the reform. I think we need revolution. Recently, I undertook the Australian Institute of Company Directors course, which gives you the governance, the understanding of governance to be a board member. And I found it overwhelming, to be honest. I found it really challenging. But I think I'm really pleased that I did it. I got through it. And I think the more of us that do that kind of course will show that we can do it. We have the capability, the capacity to do it. And then we will be sitting on more boards where we can influence culture and the way services are established, run, reviewed and reported on. So I think there's quite a bit more that we can think about in the future about lived experience governance, and we need to get up there in numbers and be really impacting the culture of services, the way money is utilised, the way we review services, the way we report on them, because if we ask the wrong questions, we're going to continue to get the wrong answers, and then we get the wrong outcomes. So lived experience governance being up there at every level, including the highest, at federal, state, service, we need to be up there with our voices. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's really wonderful to have so much experience involved in this, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Tim and Paula. Thank you so much for
Thanks, Faye.
being with us.
Wonderful platform. Thank you.
You.
Bye.
So
Bye.
Bye.